The wheel was a familiar prison. My hands, gloved in worn leather, knew every minute vibration of the steering column, every shimmy when the wind caught the trailer broadside. I'd been on I-64 for what felt like days, cutting through the belly of Kentucky. The cargo was mundane palletized auto parts destined for a distribution center in Virginia. The schedule was tight, the kind of run that turns a man into a ghost. Haunting the interstates, his only companions the hiss of air brakes and the constant, droning hum of 18 wheels on asphalt. The landscape had begun to bleed from the gentle, postcard green hills around Lexington into something flatter, more anonymous. The trees thickened, and the exits became fewer, their promises of gas, food, and lodging feeling more like echoes from a busier world. My eyes were gritty, each blink a slow, deliberate effort. The coffee from my thermos had long since lost its power, tasting now of nothing but bitterness and regret. I'd passed a decent-looking truck stop about 40 miles back, a decision I was now deeply regretting. Pride and the siren song of making up a few minutes had kept me going, but now my body was cashing the check my ambition had written. Every muscle in my back was a tightly coiled spring. My head felt heavy, my thoughts beginning to swim in that dangerous, syrupy way they do just before true micro-sleep takes over. I'd seen the consequences of that on the road before. A shredded guardrail, a flipped rig, a life snuffed out by a single, unforgiving moment of inattention. I wasn't going to be that guy. I needed a place to park, to shut down the engine and the world for a few hours. The next exit sign was a beacon in the growing twilight. Exit 118, County Road 67, services 2 miles. Services could mean anything from a single, rusted-out pump to a full-blown travel plaza. At this point, I'd take a patch of level gravel. I signaled, the click-clack of the turn indicator a metronome for my exhaustion, and guided the rig down the off-ramp. The road was a 2-lane blacktop, dark and winding, hemmed in on both sides by a wall of dense, shadowy forest. The sun was a dying ember on the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. I drove for what felt like longer than 2 miles, the trees seeming to press in closer with each passing moment. There were no other lights, no signs of civilization. A knot of unease began to tighten in my gut. This was the kind of road you see in movies right before the cell phone loses signal. Just as I was considering turning around, risking the wrath of my dispatcher for a late delivery, I saw it. A soft, yellow glow pierced the gloom up ahead. It wasn't the harsh, fluorescent blaze of a modern truck stop, but a dim, almost hazy light dot. As I drew closer, the shape of the place resolved itself. It wasn't a traditional truck stop. There was no central building with a diner and a mini-mart. Instead, a long, low-slung structure made of dark, weathered wood ran perpendicular to the road. In front of it was a vast, unpaved parking lot, and lining the lot were a series of enormous, open-fronted bays, like stalls in a stable for giants. A flickering neon sign, the letters sputtering with a faint, insect-like buzz, spelled out 2 words, Truck Motel. I slowed the rig to a crawl, the tires crunching on the loose gravel of the entrance. The place was off. It was laid out like a motel, but scaled up to an inhuman degree. The rooms were these giant stalls, each one easily large enough to accommodate a full-sized rig. And they were numbered, just like motel rooms, with crude, hand-painted numbers nailed to the wooden support posts. A single, bare bulb hung from the roof of each stall, casting a weak, lonely puddle of light onto the packed dirt floor. There were no other trucks. The lot was a vast, empty sea of shadows. My professional instinct was to keep driving. This place had trouble written all over it, but my body screamed in protest. My vision was blurring at the edges, and a deep, bone-aching fatigue had settled into my very marrow. The next proper stop could be another hour away, and I wasn't sure I had another hour left in me. This place, as strange as it was, offered the one thing I desperately needed, a place to stop. I wrestled with the decision for a full minute, the engine rumbling impatiently. Finally, exhaustion won. I guided my truck toward the entrance, the headlights sweeping across the silent, waiting stalls. I was making a mistake. I knew it in my soul, but sometimes, a man is just too tired to care. I pulled into the lot, the suspension groaning as it handled the uneven ground. The sheer scale of the place was even more unsettling up close. The stalls weren't just big. They were cavernous, with high ceilings and deep shadows gathering in their rears. Each one was equipped not with a bed or a TV, but with a heavy-duty power outlet for a block heater and a coiled hose connected to a water spigot, like a makeshift washdown station. It was a functional space, but its purpose was so singular, as so devoid of any human comfort. that it felt alien. I parked near the far end of the lot, away from the main structure, giving myself a clear view of the entrance and the other stalls. Old habits die hard. Before even thinking about shutting down, I did a full walk-around inspection of my rig, my boots kicking up little puffs of dust. The air was still and cool, carrying the damp, earthy scent of the forest and something else. A faint, metallic tang, like ozone after a lightning strike. The only sound was the ticking of my engine as it began to cool. My destination was the main building, a squat, windowless box at the center of the complex. I needed to pay for the spot, maybe find a vending machine with a halfway decent soda, and see if there was a restroom that didn't look like a biohazard. The door to the office was heavy, weathered wood, and it opened with a groan that spoke of infrequent use. The air inside was stale and thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The room was small and Spartan. A single, bare bulb hung from a wire in the center of the ceiling. The walls were bare, unpainted plywood. There was a small, formica-topped counter, and behind it, on a simple wooden stool, sat the clerk. Except it wasn't a clerk. It was a mannequin. A full-bodied, male mannequin, the kind you'd see in a cheap department store. It was dressed in a faded plaid shirt and a pair of brand-new, stiff-looking blue jeans. Its hair was a molded plastic helmet of a nondescript brown color, and its face was a blank, featureless oval, devoid of a mouth, nose, or even indents for eyes. A cold finger traced a path down my spine. This was a joke. It had to be. I looked around the tiny room, expecting a hidden camera, the sound of laughter. There was nothing. Just the silent, seated figure. On the counter in front of it was a small, handwritten sign, the letters neat and precise. Stall fee, $20. Leave-in box. Next to the sign was a metal cash box with a slot in the top. Hello. I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. Anybody here? There was no response. Only the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the single light bulb. I stepped closer to the mannequin. Its plastic skin had a waxy, lifeless sheen. One of its hands was resting on its knee, the fingers curled in a permanently relaxed pose. It was incredibly detailed, right down to the pores on its skin and the fine lines on its knuckles. The realism was gut-churning. This wasn't some cheap, abstract prop. It was a perfect, soulless replica of a human being. A part of me wanted to turn around, walk right back to my truck, and drive away into the night. Consequences be damned. But another, more stubborn part was fascinated. Who would go to such lengths? Was this some kind of art installation? A bizarre taxidermy project? I fished my wallet out of my back pocket, pulled out a $20 bill, and slipped it through the slot in the cash box. It made a soft, papery sound as it landed inside. Nothing happened. The mannequin didn't move, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge my payment in any way. Feeling like a complete fool, I backed out of the office. As I pulled the door shut, my eyes stayed locked on the seated figure until the last possible moment. Its silent, watchful presence was more unnerving than any surly, living clerk could ever be. I stood outside for a minute, taking deep breaths of the cool night air, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and I had just paid a mannequin for a night's rest. This was, without a doubt, the strangest lot I had ever parked in. Back at my truck, the ritual of shutting down for the night felt more important than ever, a small act of defiance against the strangeness of this place. I connected my rig to the heavy-duty power outlet, the plug clicking into place with a solid, reassuring thunk. I did a final check of my straps and seals, my hands moving by rote memory. Every familiar task was a tiny anchor to normality. Climbing into the sleeper berth was like entering a sanctuary. The space was small, but it was mine. The faint scent of old coffee, leather, and my own familiar smell was a comfort. I pulled the curtains closed over the windshield and the side windows, shutting out the view of the empty stalls and the dark woods beyond. For a few precious moments, I was just a man in his small, mobile home. I ate a cold sandwich from my cooler, the silence in the cab feeling heavy and expectant. I tried to read a worn-out paperback, a thriller I'd picked up at a stop in Ohio, but the words wouldn't stick. My mind kept drifting back to the mannequin. The utter blankness of its face was haunting. Why no features? Was it meant to be unfinished? Or was the lack of eyes and a mouth somehow the point? I thought about the services advertised on the exit sign. Had this place ever been meant for people? The stalls suggested a clientele that was purely mechanical. The mannequin was just a placeholder, a puppet playing the part of a human for an audience of trucks. The night deepened outside. The initial, eerie silence of the lot began to change. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, it was a watchful one. I started to hear the normal sounds of a truck at rest, the occasional ping from the engine block as it cooled, the faint sigh of the air suspension. But underneath that, I began to perceive other things. A soft creaking of wood from the stalls. A rustling in the tree line that sounded too deliberate to be the wind. My own breathing suddenly seemed too loud. I turned off the small reading light, plunging the sleeper into darkness. I peeled back, the corner of the curtain just a fraction, peering out into the lot. The weak bulbs above each stall created islands of jaundiced light in a sea of blackness. Nothing moved. The forest was a solid wall of impenetrable shadow. The main office was a dark shape in the distance, its door closed. Everything was exactly as I had left it. And yet, the feeling of being watched was so intense it was almost a physical pressure. It wasn't the mannequin. This felt bigger, older. It was as if the land itself, and the strange structure built upon it, was conscious and aware of my presence. I was an intruder here, a piece of organic matter that had strayed into a realm that belonged to something else. I lay back on my bunk, staring up at the dark ceiling of the cab. Sleep felt like a distant, impossible concept. My nerves were stretched taut, every sense on high alert. I was a prisoner in my own truck, waiting for a sunrise that felt like it would never come. The initial weirdness had curdled into a deep, primal fear. I was not welcome here. I must have dozed off, because the sound jolted me awake with a force that sent my heart hammering against my ribs. It was the sound of a diesel engine turning over. Not the healthy, powerful roar of a well-tuned rig, but a ragged, grinding, labored sound. The starter motor whined, the engine coughed a dry, hacking sound, and then it caught, settling into a low, irregular idle that sputtered and missed. I scrambled to the window, my hands fumbling with the curtain. The sound was coming from one of the stalls about 100 yards away. Stall 7. It was empty. I had checked it during my walk around. There was no truck in it. But now, from the deep shadows at the back of that stall, I could see the faint glow of exhaust fumes, pale and spectral in the dim light. The engine continued to run, a sickly, rhythmic heartbeat in the night. Before I could process this, another sound joined it. From stall 12, across the lot, came the sharp, pneumatic hiss of air brakes releasing. PSSSSHHHHT. It was the sound a truck makes when the driver gets out, a final, settling sigh. But there was no driver. There was no truck. The stall was just as empty as before. The sound hung in the air, clear and unmistakable. A cold terror, colder than any I have ever known, seized me. I was frozen at the window, my breath fogging the glass. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a hallucination born of fatigue. These were real, mechanical sounds emanating from empty spaces. Then, a third sound started. A slow, deliberate clunk clunk clunk, like a drive shaft engaging, or a landing gear being cranked. It was coming from stall 3. The lot was no longer silent. It was a symphony of ghostly mechanics. The sounds didn't overlap randomly. They seemed to be communicating. The sick engine in stall 7 would rev weakly, and in response, the air brakes in stall 12 would hiss again. A turn signal began to click from the direction of stall 9, a steady, metronomic tick-tock that cut through the low rumbling. It was a conversation. They were talking to each other, not with words, but with the language of their own components, the language of the road. I watched, paralyzed, as the phenomena continued. A pair of headlights flickered on in the empty darkness of stall 5, to blinding white eyes that stared out across the lot for a few seconds before winking out. The sound of a door being unlatched, a heavy, metallic thunk, echoed from my left. I saw nothing. No forms, no shapes, no shimmering apparitions. Just the sounds and the lights of trucks that weren't there, going through the motions of their former lives. This was their motel. This was where they came to rest, these phantom rigs, these ghostly haulers with invisible cargo and drivers long since turned to dust. The mannequin wasn't a joke. It was the perfect clerk for a place like this. It asked no questions, demanded no explanations. It was just a fixture, as mechanical and soulless as the clients it served. I was an anomaly here, a living, breathing creature in a world of echoes. I slid down from the window, pressing my back against the cold metal of the cab door. I pulled my knees to my chest, a child hiding from a monster. The sounds outside continued their spectral discourse, a nightly ritual I was never meant to witness. The night was theirs, and I was just a trespasser in it. Time lost all meaning. The symphony of the phantom trucks ebbed and flowed. There would be periods of near silence, broken only by that single, sputtering engine in stall 7, which never quite died. And then a new flurry of activity would begin. The blare of an air horn, short and sharp, would make me jump. It wasn't the long, mournful cry of a rig on the highway, but a staccato burst, like a signal. An answer would come from another stall too. Quick blasts. I found I could almost follow the conversation. A series of relay clicks from one stall would be followed by the whine of a power window motor from another. It was a debate, a gossip session, a swapping of stories from roads that no longer existed. I imagined them talking about brutal grades they'd climbed, near misses in blinding rain, the best lots with the cheapest diesel. They were reliving their glory days, the endless miles they had conquered when they were kings of the asphalt. My initial, petrifying fear began to mutate into a strange, horrified fascination. I was a witness to something impossible, a secret layer of reality that was never meant for human eyes. I thought of all the legends truckers told in hushed tones over bad coffee, stories of phantom trucks that appeared in blizzards to guide lost drivers, of rigs that vanished from way stations, of ghostly hitchhikers who spoke of routes that weren't on any map. Were those just fragments of this? Glimpses of this other world that existed parallel to our own? I couldn't stay here. The resolve solidified in my gut, a hard, cold knot. As soon as the first hint of dawn touched the sky, I was gone. I wouldn't wait for a full sunrise. I would drive in the gray, pre-dawn light, fatigue be damned. The thought of spending another minute in this place was untenable. The sounds were a constant reminder that I was sleeping in a graveyard, or worse, a waiting room. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the floor of my sleeper, my back against the driver's seat. I didn't dare look out the window again. I just listened. The sounds began to change as the night wore on. The conversational tones faded, replaced by something that sounded more like preparation. Engines revved with more purpose. The clunk of gears being shifted became more frequent. They were getting ready to leave. Their night's rest was almost over. This realization brought a new kind of anxiety. What happened when they left? Would I see them? Would they pass through my solid, physical truck? The thought was enough to make my skin crawl. I checked my watch every 5 minutes, the glowing digits crawling through the hours with agonizing slowness. 3 a.m., 3:30, 4 o'clock. The darkness outside the curtains began to feel less absolute. The black was softening to a deep, charcoal gray. The end was in sight. I just had to hold on a little longer. I was a sailor trapped in the doldrums, praying for any breath of wind to carry me away from this cursed sea. By 5:30 a.m., the lot had fallen completely silent. The last sound had been the sputtering engine in stall 7. It had given one final, wet-sounding cough and then cut out. The silence that followed feeling heavier and more profound than any that had come before. The conversation was over. The patrons had checked out. I waited another 30 minutes, my body tense, ears straining for any sign that they were still there. There was nothing. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. Slowly, carefully, I pushed myself up from the floor. Every joint ached from the tension and the cold. I felt 100 years old. I crept toward the passenger side window, my hand trembling as I reached for the curtain. I pulled it back an inch. The gray light of dawn filtered into the lot, washing everything in a dull, monochrome pallor. The mist from the forest had crept in, lying in low, ghostly tendrils over the ground. I scanned the stalls, one by one. Stall 3, Stall 5, Stall 7, Stall 9, Stall 12, all of them were empty. Not just empty of trucks, but empty of any sign that anything had ever been there. No tire tracks in the hard-packed dirt of the stalls. No puddles of oil or coolant. No lingering smell of diesel exhaust in the crisp morning air. It was as if the entire night had been a fever dream. A vivid hallucination born of extreme exhaustion and the power of suggestion from that creepy mannequin. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it wasn't. The memory of those sounds was burned into my brain, too real, too specific to be invented. I had to get out of there, now. The urgency was a physical force. I didn't bother with my normal, careful pre-trip inspection. I didn't coil the power cable neatly. I just yanked it from the outlet and tossed it onto the passenger seat. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I turned it. My own engine roared to life, a loud, living, blessedly normal sound that shattered the oppressive silence. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I didn't allow myself to think. I threw the rig into gear and began to pull out of the stall, my eyes fixed on the gravel road that led back to the highway. As I swung the truck around, my headlights swept across the main office. I couldn't help but look. The door was open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the mannequin. It was no longer sitting on its stool. It was standing upright, its blank, featureless face pointed directly at me. One of its plastic hands was raised, not in a wave, but held up, palm out, as if in a gesture of farewell. Or perhaps a warning. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through me. I stomped on the accelerator, the tires spinning in the gravel before catching and launching me forward. I didn't look in my mirrors. I didn't care. I focused only on the road ahead, fleeing that place as if the hounds of hell were on my bumper. I didn't slow down until my rig was screaming up the on-ramp and back onto the solid, predictable expanse of I-64 East. The sun was properly up now, a golden light burning off the last of the morning mist. Other cars and trucks shared the road with me, their presence a profound relief. I was back in the world of the living. I drove for 2 hours straight, my knuckles white on the wheel, before my nerves settled enough to even consider stopping for coffee. At a bustling, brightly lit travel plaza swarming with drivers, I finally pulled over. The mundane chaos of it was a balm. The smell of greasy food, the chatter on the CB, the sight of other human beings going about their lives. I stood in the shower for a long time, letting the hot water scald my skin, trying to wash the feeling of that place off me. I never told my dispatcher. What would I have said? I never filed a report. Who would I tell? The police? They'd have laughed me out of the precinct. I tried to rationalize it. Mass hallucination. A sophisticated hoax using speakers. But the explanations felt hollow, pathetic attempts to cage something that couldn't be caged. The memory of that raised plastic hand haunted me. Had it moved? Had it always been in that position and I just hadn't seen it? My mind chewed on the details for the rest of the run, and for many runs after. I never saw that exit again. I deliberately altered my routes to avoid that entire sector of Kentucky. Sometimes, on a long, quiet night haul, when the road is empty and my mind begins to wander, I think I hear things. A faint, sputtering engine in the distance, the ghost of an air brake sigh. I turn up the radio and grip the wheel tighter. I still drive. It's what I do, but I'm more careful about where I park now. I stick to the big, noisy, well-lit lots, the ones bursting with life. I avoid the quiet, lonely places, the ones tucked away down dark, winding roads, because I know now, with a certainty that will stay with me until my last day on this earth, that the world is a stranger place than we can ever know. And on certain nights, in certain forgotten corners of this land, the machines we built to conquer the distances come home to rest. And they don't need us there to watch them do it. In fact, they'd prefer we didn't. That motel wasn't for me. It never was. I was just a temporary, unwanted guest in a place where the ghosts of the highway spend the night,